John Cameron, you've still got your camera on. Right. Well, welcome to this meeting of the Scottish Forest and Timber Technology Mid-Scotland. And the subject of the discussion today is on deer management in the forest. Thanks very much to Scottish Forestry and to the industry leadership group for sponsoring these meetings, and to Confor, Jamie Farker in particular, for organising it. The theme of today's meeting is, if anything, perhaps a little bit too topical, given that the Scottish Government's response to the Deer Working Group recommendations was published at 10 o'clock this very morning. So there has been a bit of frantic work, I think, from some of our speakers just to get themselves fully up to date on that. The Deer Working Group recommendations will have an impact on how deer are managed throughout Scotland, and that will, of course, impact on the forestry sector as well. Some issues that I hope that we will cover today, and this is not an exhaustive list, but we're looking at deer management against a backdrop of trying to increase the area of forestry in Scotland through new woodland creation, and woodlands are, of course, deer's natural habitat. And there are some obvious issues that arise from that. There's pressure which has been applied to land managers for a number of years now to reduce deer numbers, that pressure coming from conservation groups and politicians. At the same time, we've got what I might refer to as the Packham effect, public opposition to killing anything, which makes the practice of deer management as a pastime for a lot of people almost unacceptable to members of the public, or increasing numbers of members of the public. This year, of course, we've had COVID to contend with, which has had obvious effects on people actually getting out to physically manage deer, as well as the effect that it will have had on venison marketing. And then, of course, we had the brilliant idea of the reintroduction of shooting rates, where the base rate being applied to woodlands was the highest of any land use. So we found ourselves in the sort of bizarre situation where some people were finding that they were being grant aided to help with the costs of deer control within forests, and then at the same time being taxed for exactly the same activity. So we have three speakers today who will put forward their views and experiences on the issue of deer management in the forest. Firstly, Jamie Hammond from Nature Scotland. Jamie joined the Deer Commission Scotland at that time in 2008. DCS, of course, then becoming part of SNH, and SNH now transmogrified into Nature Scot. Jamie deals with all deer management issues relating to central, south and west Scotland, and he also owns and runs his own deer farm. We'll then have a presentation from Tom Turnbull. Tom is the Vice Chair of the Association of Deer Management Groups and is a hands-on land manager of Strone Estate in Argyll. So has a lot of practical experience of managing deer. And then we'll move on to a presentation from Winston Churchill. Win has over 40 years of experience in delivering deer management within the forest. Winston was initially with the Economic Forestry Group, and then set up his own business, and has been very active in the field of marketing venison If anyone's ever tried any of Wynn's burgers at any of these big meetings or game fairs and things like that, then they'll know what I mean. We will have questions at the end of all three presentations, please. So if you care to put forward any questions, and we already have a few, please do so through the chat facility. You will also have seen in your invitation that we've had written updates on activity supplied to us by Confor and the industry leadership group. It's not the intention to spend time at this meeting going through those in any detail, but if there are any questions, if you have read those pieces of work, please do feel free to ask them, and we'll try and deal with them at the end. One point I would highlight on the Confor update in particular is that Jamie mentions in that there has been activity in dealing with the impending guidance on ground preparation. That has very recently gained a lot of momentum, and there are some big issues there that the industry will need to consider in terms of future ground preparation. If I could just remind everyone, please, that if you're not giving a presentation, please turn off your cameras and mute your microphones. And with that, I will now hand over to Jamie Hammond. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Raymond. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Jamie, for your kind invite to speak this afternoon. As Raymond said, there's as of this morning, there's quite a lot going on in the deer world, so I will do my best to capture some of that findings of the report from this morning as best I can. I'm not going to give a presentation per se. I'm just going to run through some points I've made. So I'll start with the Deer Working Group report. As Raymond alluded to, that's the kind of long-awaited response from Scottish Government, which was released at 10 o'clock this morning. So it's very much, for those of us that are closely involved with the deer industry, it's very much at the front of our minds from all camps, I suppose, to understand what it means for us going forward. In terms of some of the headline messages from that, the Scottish Government supports most of the 99 recommendations made. Many of those recommendations were pretty detailed and complex, and it's pretty obvious to most that they will require further consideration to kind of understand the legal effects of those. There will need to be full consideration and consultation with stakeholders over the practical implementation of many of those recommendations. They are wide-ranging, and they obviously cover many facets of deer in terms of practicalities, legislation, and general perceptions. But broadly, to kind of in summary, what they're looking to do is to improve the consistency in terms of legislation and remove restrictions on where, when, and how deer can be taken and killed. To provide a clearer vision for deer management based on public interest within that wider context, which we're all well aware of in terms of the climate emergency and biodiversity loss, with clear actions about how we deliver those aims. They look to set clearer thresholds for what we deem as acceptable levels of impact to public interest. There's an emphasis on the greater use of regulation as a means of promoting wider compliance and more focus on individual responsibilities in terms of those that own and manage land. A greater equity in addressing the range of public interests impacted by deer, and in conclusion, increasing the way that information can be accessed to help inform decision making going forward. So from our perspective, in terms of Nature Scot, as Scotland's Deer Authority, we have a significant role in I suppose, in helping taking this forward with the sector, and we're certainly clear over a number of things in here that as we well know, there has been significant progress over the last decade in managing deer numbers in Scotland. The combination of the biodiversity crisis and climate change does require, or has focused the minds for many of us and placed, I suppose, a greater urgency on efforts to ensure sustainable deer management going forward, given that the role that they play. Generally, we recognise that more can be done to realise the ambitious targets, around forestry regeneration, woodland creation, peatland restoration, and habitat improvement. Clearly, protection of the significant investments being made in natural solutions, linked with carbon emissions and efforts to enhance and restore biodiversity across Scotland, will continue to need to be the main focus for deer management policy going forward. We also know that deer have an important socioeconomic value as a resource and are a much loved part of the rural landscape, but also obviously do impact on our vulnerable habitats. So sustainable deer management needs to not only bring environmental improvements, but also social and economic benefits to the rural communities. So in terms of those recommendations, being so hot off the press, obviously all involved will need to take time to take stock, I suppose, of the impact of those and understand what it means for everyone. As we understand it, Scottish Government have set out their intention to bring forward the legislative changes in terms of changes to the Deer Scotland Act within the next parliamentary term. From our point of view, from Nature Scot, we'll obviously have a lead role in taking forward many of the recommendations, particularly those that won't require legislative change. But there's obviously wide-ranging and significant areas of work for us, which we will need to look at in terms of prioritising, planning, and working out resourcing to deliver that. Those of you that are close to the coalface in terms of deer management, and if you've had time to reflect on the recommendations and the responses and what's been agreed in terms of accepted in principle, will no doubt have recognised that within those that there are some that will likely to be controversial for different stakeholders. And those include things like removing the closed season for male deer, the use of thermal imaging, night vision equipment, the competence register, and deer density targets. There's clearly a big job to do for us and many other of our stakeholders and other agencies to engage with stakeholders' interests and work with Scottish Government in considering, consulting, and taking forward this work against the kind of wider context of land use change. Some more general points around deer and woodland and deer and forestry. That was the ask for today in terms of Nature Scot, and I suppose these are based on my experiences in terms of my time as a deer management officer for the Deer Commission previously, then SNH, and Nature Scot now. So these are based, I suppose, in terms of my work with across the sector, dealings with deer management groups and practitioners from a wide range of angles. But broadly, I suppose, it's obvious to all of us that there are significant opportunities in terms of woodland creation and management, in terms of contributing to that big ticket items around climate change and biodiversity. We do, however, need to continue to learn lessons and ensure that the practical management side of things in relation to deer is dialed into that. And, I think a general observation would be that, deer management from a crop protection point of view should not always be seen as a revenue generator. It's got to be taken seriously and it needs to be planned for, and it must be viewed as a cost. For many of you, the last 12 months will have presented significant challenges in terms of delivering deer management on the ground against the backdrop of COVID and the impact that's had on activities. But I guess what it might have allowed is the opportunity to explore the different models of deer management and how, boots on the ground and the culling of deer across the forestry sector is delivered. As you well know, there are many different models that are used, from the FLS model in terms of full-time ranger complement, use of contractors, right the way through to the other end of the spectrum in terms of the use of recreational and vocational stalkers to deliver culls. But as we well know, each model has its merits and problems, and there are significant changes geographically in terms of my experience as to the effectiveness of those different models. That's obviously closely linked with authorizations, which are very much part and parcel in using the tools that are available to deliver deer management in that crop protection context. So again, many of you will be well familiar with that process in terms of out of season culling, night shooting. Clearly, some of those deer working group recommendations around seasons, competence, etc., will have a bearing on that. And from a forester's point of view, will no doubt perhaps improve or give a greater flexibility in terms of the use of the full availability of the tools within the Deer Act to deliver deer management. Things like the use of thermal imaging. There's a trial underway and has been from last year and this winter. That will conclude at the latter part of this year. But there's obviously a push from government to consider whether that's something that should be introduced in terms of authorizing the use of those newer types of technology to improve culling efficiency. In addition, as we well know, that there's a greater expectation and drive to look at non-lead bullet alternatives, and from a practitioner's point of view, that will obviously have a bearing, and that features quite heavily within the deer working group recommendations as well. Again, looking at the impacts of COVID and where deer controllers live and distance from the forest, I suppose does give an opportunity to better explore the impacts of localism in terms of sourcing local controllers who are people that are able to deliver deer management on the ground, but also in terms of the supply of venison. Clearly, the challenges are not just around establishment of woodlands, but are also much more likely going into third and fourth rotation as forest structure changes. The establishment of native broadleaves and soft conifers without fencing, as we well know, continues to be a challenge in certain parts of the country and where multi-species of deer might be present. And again, Tom and Winston might talk later in terms of their experiences from the cow area. Again, from my experiences across, this talk's focused on deer, obviously, but more often than not, we're not always talking about deer and that the kind of recognition of the wider range of herbivores within the forest structure. Will also obviously include hares, sheep, goats, hares, rabbits. And when we look at the role of Nature Scott and how we use our regulation or not to facilitate deer management on the ground, often things can be further complicated by other herbivores. I think the greater push for mixed age forests, mixed species, will require consideration of, looking at how collaboration works. I know Tom will talk about the merits of collaboration and how that has been effective in terms of the upland red deer range and the link in terms of neighbouring forestry ground and how that works. And for many, obviously, both public and private forestry companies are closely involved with that deer management group process. In terms of deer management planning, there's been a significant amount of work over the last 3 to 5 years around DMGs and the work that's done. But within the forest structure, there's obviously different views on how deer impact on different people. And I think there's got to be a significant push about recognising the responsibility of forest owners to take responsibility for the deer on their ground. And we can't always blame our neighbours in terms of the impacts that they happen. Clearly, the application and merits of deer groups doesn't always work everywhere in all situations. And as we well know, within the deer group structure and those that are focused around more forestry orientated landscapes, such as cow, borders deer management groups, North West Scotland, for example, they have had their challenges. For some of them, they've been around for a long time, and interest comes and goes depending on what's topical at the time, whether stakeholders feel the overwhelming need to talk to their neighbours or understand what's going on. They're often seen as talking shops, and people question the value of them. But I think not losing sight of recognising where they can be valuable in terms of information exchange, sharing data, informing cull planning, and helping direct resources, etc. We know within the deer working group recommendations, there's been a greater push and expectation that the continued focus on upland red deer range, whilst has not been lost, there's an expectation that there still needs to be some focus within areas out with that. So obviously that falls closely within the forestry sector, both in an upland and lowland context. Equally, the impact of deer on agricultural land, again, it's nothing new, but continues to rumble on, and there is an expectation that from a sales point of view, understanding that impact and seeing how we can support and address that in terms of the agricultural sector. And there are examples, geographically where that continues to be problems, whether that's in Carl or parts of Aberdeenshire, and more locally for me, our work over the last 3 years in terms of the Flanders Moss area west of Stirling, where Nature Scott's been using its Section 10 powers to help facilitate deer management on the ground. There's been a lot of talk within the working group report around impacts versus deer numbers. You will have seen some preamble around proposals around the upper limit in terms of deer densities on the open range, and potentially the knock-on effect that has across the forestry side of things. In line with that, we've always had, I think collectively as an industry, this struggle between looking at impacts versus numbers and the data and information we use that in terms of nearest neighbour damage assessments, dung counting, open range deer counting, etc. From our sales point of view, we continue to trying to keep abreast of technology. So over the last 12 months, some of you will have been aware of our work with the SG CivTech initiative, looking at new types of technology for herbivore population assessments. So that's been the use of satellite imagery, UAVs, so drones linked with artificial intelligence to collect and analyze data on deer populations. Now, whilst they've focused on the upland open range, where obviously counting deer is easier, that's not to say as this area continues to develop, I do see a role for some of that in certain types of woodland habitat, where it will be another tool in our armory to provide information. There is a role for for continued joined up working between the agencies, particularly between ourselves and Scottish Forestry. And we continue to need to think about what the future will bring in terms of the lifetimes of forests and restructuring as that goes forward. Okay, I'll draw a breath there. I'm conscious there are other speakers coming. I'd imagine there will be a number of questions around the Deer Working Group report, so I wasn't planning to say any more than that. So I will close there and I think hand on to Tom Turnbull. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jamie. And now introduce Tom Turnbull. Tom, as I said, is Vice Chair of the Association of Deer Management Groups. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Raymond. And thank you all very much for the opportunity to speak to you today. My practical experience of managing deer on the open hill, and to a lesser extent in woodland at the top of Loch Fyne, has meant that I've become increasingly involved in landscape scale collaborative deer management over the last 12 years. Initially at a local level as a member of the Inverary and Tyndrum Deer Management Group, and then subsequently I've had more involvement with the Association of Deer Management Groups, for which I'm now currently Vice Chairman. I've been asked to talk to you a bit today about the potential for landscape scale deer management in areas of extensive forestry. Voluntary collaborative deer management in the form of deer management groups came about initially because of a shared resource, often based on the sporting cull of red deer across a landscape. There are now 45 member deer management groups covering the Highlands. These groups have now a far widening management objectives within their membership, from forestry to environmental and to sporting as well. The forestry sector is obviously an important part of this membership, with deer movements between forest and the open hill always a consideration for management and sometimes a bone of contention as well. In the lowlands, the Lowland Deer Network has been established for some time, and these groups operate separately from the Highland Deer Management Groups, with roe deer often being the predominant deer species and with fractured land ownership being more common, which can provide its own challenges. Where deer management groups already exist, we've been tasked with focusing on the management of deer in the public interest, and more recently in light of the climate crisis. The last 10 years has seen a rapid change in the way that most deer management groups go about their work. The catalyst for this change has been the NatureScot assessment process that deer management groups have been asked to undertake during 2014, 16 and 19. This has seen deer management groups assessed 3 times by NatureScot on 101 criteria based on their deer management processes, and particularly on their deer management plans, all of which are now publicly available online. The emphasis from NatureScot has been for us to demonstrate how we're managing deer in the public interest and using habitat data and population models to set cull targets. Following the last assessment in 2019, the SNH report to Scottish Government summarised the progress that had been made by deer management groups. And whilst there was some room for improvement, it was clear that significant progress had been made over the 3 assessments. Running parallel with the SNH report to Scottish Government, we saw the publication of the Independent Deer Working Group report in early 2020. And as you've heard from Jamie, we've had the government response to the working group report this morning at 10 o'clock, and the government have seen fit to accept almost all of the 99 recommendations. Whilst many of the recommendations are concerned with the tidying up of statute, there are changes that would be directly applicable to the forestry sector, as Jamie touched on. For example, the removal of the season for male deer. The Scottish Government has been tasked with keeping a greater account of expenditure by the public sector each year on the management of wild deer and on the damage caused by deer. There's an ongoing investigation by NatureScot into the use of night sights for deer, and subject to approval from NatureScot, it's likely that that will become possible. And the report also recommends the allocation of considerably more of its resource to the management of deer out with the open hill red deer range. These are just some of the points that will have considerable ramifications for deer management going forward. On reading the response, one of my first thoughts was that it takes a far greater interest in the management of deer outside the traditional deer management group area. I believe that there's likely to be a greater focus will fall on the management of deer out with the established deer management groups. None of these changes are going to happen immediately, and there will, I'm sure, be considerable consultation going forward. Meanwhile, with this backdrop, the appetite for tree planting in the UK has only seemingly increased. The country still imports 81% of its timber, and when this is combined with the desire to plant trees in the light of the climate crisis, the potential habitat for deer could increase considerably. Public policy and private investment will likely be available for woodland projects, and marginal land will be considered as potential sites for carbon offsetting or planting forestry. Meanwhile, forestry that was planted in the 1970s and 1980s is being harvested and restructured, recreating a mixed-age woodland that is even more inviting for deer. Over the last 2 years, the Scottish Government has clearly demonstrated that it's committed to collaborative land management on a large scale, with the Land Commission consultation on regional land use partnerships and the subsequent recent announcement of 5 pilot regions: Cairngorms National Park, Highland Council Region, Loch Lomond and Trossachs National Park, North East Region and South of Scotland. Into the future, it's clear that collaboration is necessary across the board, and I'm sure that the forestry sector will play an important part in that. It is possible that regional land use partnerships will also be a source of potential funding going forward as well. At the same time as this, the breadth of topics discussed at deer management group meetings has seen a widening of discussion, and some of our membership have decided to call themselves land management groups as opposed to deer management groups. This is an evolution that I believe is likely to continue. However, the focus remains very much on deer. My experience of deer management within forestry comes largely from the Cowal Peninsula, on which I've been trying to help establish the Cowal Deer Working Group, where the creation of extensive areas of forestry in the 70s and 80s has led to an ideal habitat for red deer. Our intention is to come up with a collaborative deer management system that is useful and helpful to foresters. I'm sure that Winston will elaborate more on the challenges of managing deer on Cowal. No one knows better than him the challenges that are present, and also on the changes that he's seen over the years. But the more splintered nature of land ownership within Cowal compared to the Highlands has meant that the collaboration has had its challenges. But I do see cowl as an indication of what the future may hold for areas that are yet to be planted, and that may increase habitat for deer. So how could a collaborative structure for deer management work in practice in areas of extensive woodland cover as opposed to the open hill? The reduction in browsing pressure will likely be the most important factor in the forest. Working together to mitigate this is surely of benefit. After all, there's very little point in diligently managing your own deer population if nightly raids by deer from adjacent ground is preventing your ability to establish trees and costing you or your client money. Perhaps there'd be an advantage to considering woodland areas with neighbours at the felling stage. If restocking is imminent, then areas where felling is planned could perhaps see higher levels of deer management at an early stage so that deer numbers are hopefully at a level that is optimal to restocking. Planning in advance on a wider scale is surely beneficial to this process. Whilst deer counting and population modelling is more difficult in forestry, browsing damage is the key indication of deer presence, at which point culling may already be too late. Access is vitally important to deer management, with ATV access being crucial in areas of woodland. However, there's also sometimes an advantage to obtaining access either from stalking or carcass extraction from adjacent properties. If this can be discussed and considered locally, then deer populations can hopefully be maintained at a level that is optimum to establishing trees. Forest design is obviously important when considering deer management. This may also be an area for discussion at group level. Feedback and help on forest structure would enable the members of landscape scale projects to learn from one another. Indeed, if the priority is to manage deer, is there a benefit for blurring the boundaries between land holdings when it comes to deer management, or sharing culling resources? If sporting stalking is not the priority, the ability to cull deer on a cross-boundary basis and across a wider habitat could be a tool to be managed at a localized level. Venison sales have been hit hard by COVID, and I'm sure that Winston will elaborate on this. But I'm hopeful that venison may be a more popular meat to the consumer in the future, especially when we consider the sustainable credentials that it has. The price, as I'm sure some of you will know, has fallen from around £2.30 a kilo to £1 a kilo. In order that we can maintain a good price later after the COVID and hopefully a recovery of the venison industry, the consumer does need some assurances. It's likely that traceability and quality assurance are only to become more vital. The 2015 E. coli outbreak from venison was a warning to us all. Currently, the number of larders available in many areas outside the Highlands is relatively low. Is it possible that larders could be created in conjunction with neighbours, or even that funding may be possible from government for community larders that can service a wider landscape scale deer management project? Deer managers across the Highlands are being asked to demonstrate that they're managing deer in the public interest, and some deer management groups have been able to attract funding for schemes based on collaborative applications, whether that be for habitat impact assessments or investigations into the feasibility of peatland restoration. The ability to demonstrate management on a landscape scale has already seen some significant benefits for some deer management groups. Lastly, talking to one another and discussing shared objectives and goals does have its benefits. As a deer manager myself, I know that every time I go onto the hill, I learn something new about how to manage them. The knowledge comes in so useful the next time I go out stalking. Likewise, I believe that sharing the experiences and knowledge gained from managing deer within a landscape can only be beneficial. There are obviously fundamental differences in the nature of deer management according to species. Red deer, for example, may well be more transient. Roe deer might be more territorial. All, however, must be managed in order to get trees away. Collaboration may be needed to a greater or lesser extent, depending on the species of deer present. However, I think that it is likely to be useful and helpful to forest management in most circumstances. So the question is, what should the model be for landscape scale deer management within areas of extensive forestry? My answer to that would be that there may be a variety of options. Currently, where a collaborative structure doesn't exist, forest managers have the chance to design a model that works for them. What do you want to get out of it? What are your priorities? How can liaising with one another benefit good, sensible, cost-effective forest management that limits deer damage? If you have the chance to make landscape scale management work for you, then surely it's better to do that now than to have something imposed upon you that may not meet your objectives. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm going to pass on now to Winston, who will give you a lot more information on management in the forestry.
Thanks very much, Tom. And if I can now just introduce Winston Churchill. Winston is based on the Cowell Peninsula as well, down near Sandbank, and has there will be very few people in the deer management world within the forest with more experience than Win. So we're about to get the benefit of that now. Thank you, Win.
Thank you, Raymond. Both flattered and slightly embarrassed to be given all this this sort of high praise from you. But anyway, and thank you all for inviting me to participate in today's meeting. It is a very hot subject just now, that's for sure. Firstly, just to say that almost all of my experience with deer has been on the Cowell Peninsula, apart from working with fallow deer on an estate for some years in England, many moons ago. I've worked exclusively with deer on Cowell for the past, as Raymond said, it's actually just shy of 40 years, but it's pretty close, and have seen a huge change in land use, habitat, and an incredible change in the deer population and how they've responded to the habitat that's been created for them. But before talking about the deer in the woodlands, I'd like to give you a brief background to my working life so that you can see how I've come into this, you could call it industry linked to commercial forestry. I was born as a gamekeeper's son, and from the time that I was strong enough, I wanted no more than to follow my dad and help him where and when possible. I left school when I was 15 and followed my passion to be a gamekeeper. By the time I was 28, I had become head keeper on an estate in Northamptonshire, but had also by then become disillusioned with commercial pheasant shooting. It was not the type of work that I had grown up with. My true passion was working with nature and wild game / animals. During this time, that is the late 70s and early 80s, I'd made contacts and friends in the forestry world in Dunoon. A friend and I visited annually or more frequently when possible for deer stalking holidays. I quickly realized that this was for me, working with wild animals on a grand scale in a beautiful and wild country. The opportunity came during the early 80s. I joined EFG during the spring of 1983 as a deer stalker / controller, being paid to shoot deer. This was heaven for a young, energetic and man with endless enthusiasm. My job / department was funded by the forestry investors. Each contributed to the EFG's wildlife management account. However, like most good things in life, it did not last. Schedule D tax was removed. So tax relief on forestry expenditure came to an end. My job as I knew it was under threat and almost bound to change. Soon the forests that I was responsible for were looking for rent rather than paying out for someone to control their deer. The writing was fully on the wall, so opportunities arose and I left EFG during autumn 1988 and started Winston Churchill stalking, which we still run today. We took on rentals and made our living from venison and a few paying stalking guests. The income was split roughly 50-50, and our focus was on control with sport as a tag on. By that time, a large proportion of the plantable land on Cowell had been planted. Forestry Commission, as it was then, had most of the older established forests, and the private sector had the young plantations. The young plantations seemed to go on forever. It seemed like an ocean of Sitka spruce. Prior to planting, the land had been used for sheep, and there were very few deer, red or roe, on Cowell, except in the established forest owned by FC. However, once the sheep came off and the land was planted, roe appeared quite quickly. They responded well to this wonderful new habitat. They became established very quickly and maintained quite high densities up until canopy closure. Red deer were much slower to colonize. We would occasionally see them in the young plantations, and we would try and take advantage of that, but the populations were mainly restricted to FC forests. However, as private forests developed and went into thicket stage, the habitat was becoming less favorable to roe and was now favoring red deer. We saw roe numbers decline and red deer establish and increase in all Cowell forests, and even crossing the Carls of Bute to establish themselves on the Isle of Bute, and are now in significant numbers. This is an island where red deer had never been before, and it's my belief that it was the pressure of the population on the peninsula that sort of created this wave to go across onto the island. By now, every forest in the private sector had a stalking tenant. Despite the stalking pressures, red deer were able to increase. Once they had colonized all forests across the peninsula, their densities started to rise. In those days, it was not such a problem because clear felling and restocking had not started. We had what seemed like endless single-age Sitka spruce, so why not generate some income for the forest owners in the form of sporting rents? However, once restocking in the private sector started on Cowell, which was around about 20 years ago, it became clear very quickly that we would have problems. The young plants and the deer are there 24/7, and the deer controllers cannot be everywhere all the time. By then, the conservation lobby was beginning to get stronger, and the deer were becoming public enemy number one. Forestry Commission, as it was still called then, went to war with deer at enormous cost. They are still at war with deer and at an even greater cost, but still have problems. I felt that the private sector had rather lost its way at this particular time and was still following the sporting rental policy. To add to the difficulties, the value of venison was not increasing, and yet all the costs associated with killing deer were increasing by at least inflation. The split between venison and paying guests within our business during 2019-2020 was 75-25, that is 75% paying guest income and 25% venison income, bearing in mind that it was 50-50 when we started the business. And had it not been for COVID, which stopped all our stalking guests, the split during the current season would have had to have been 87.5% sporting income against 12.5% venison income, because as Tom pointed out, there's been quite a dramatic fall in venison values. Not to depress ourselves further, and Raymond has touched on it, we have the reintroduction of sporting rates, a time bomb without doubt. The simple figures demonstrate how our business has had to increasingly consider sporting. However, I'm pleased to say that some land managers have now identified this, and we are in the process of change where we will be more involved with forest management and financially assisted to ensure our objectives are parallel to forest management. It is a major change and a major step in the right direction. So we have 3 questions, I think. Do we need to reduce deer densities? If so, can we effectively achieve it? And what are our deer densities? Taking the 3 questions in reverse, it is not possible to accurately measure deer densities in our large areas of spruce. But I was very pleased to hear what Jamie had to say there about possible new technologies, so that would be very helpful. But for sure, we have a high deer population here in Cowell that is now fully established across the whole peninsula. So how do we bring the deer densities down to a level that allows regen planted hardwoods and soft conifers to establish without fencing? Personally, I don't think that is possible in our environment without radical change. FLS has been trying for 20 years and cannot achieve it. So why should we? Killing seasons have been extended. Night shooting is now standard practice. We even have night vision, and it's quite possible we should progress to night, being able to shoot at night with using night vision telescopic sights and so on. So why can't we achieve what nature would be able to achieve in a natural environment? The answer is very radical, and I'm not promoting it, but let's stand back and have a look at how nature would deal with it. Large carnivores have their babies to coincide when herbivores have their babies. That gives them a plentiful supply of food. A large carnivore has no emotions as to what it kills and when it kills it. It's tooth and claw, but it works. There are 2 very good examples of how nature has dealt with this problem. The first was in the early 1980s. The fox in Sweden became very badly affected by mange. It almost wiped them out. During that period, when the fox numbers were dangerously low, roe deer numbers spiraled to a point where they became a problem. But once the fox numbers recovered, roe deer numbers went back to the normal level. The other example is Yellowstone Park. Once the wolf was removed, the elk numbers spiraled, and after some years were destroying the habitat. The wolf was reintroduced, and within a remarkably short space of time, everything came back into balance. It seems harsh and cruel, but that's how it works. I would not wish to see the wolf back in Scotland. It would eventually destroy our business, and I'm quite sure that the sheep farmers would not welcome it either. Equally, I'm not proposing that we shoot babies in the summer and females all year round. It goes fully against our ethics, and I don't know any stalker that would be prepared to do it. Having said that, most of us would not think twice about it when it comes to other species during their reproductive season, i.e. rabbits, rats, foxes. In fact, for a gamekeeper to kill a milky vixen is a triumph, almost something to celebrate. Man has created this situation by removing the large predators and creating the most wonderful habitat for the deer. Then we impose seasons upon ourselves to stop ourselves killing and protect the deer during the reproduction period of that animal. Third question, do we need deer densities to be that low? In my opinion, to achieve it, we would have to have a shoot on site policy all year round of both sexes. The cost would be enormous. Politically, it would be a disaster. Imagine what the media would make of that, and finding people to do it would be very difficult, if possible. There could be no let up either, otherwise the deer would simply bounce back. In my opinion, there is middle ground. Firstly, the deer manager should work closely with the forest manager and not just be a name on a sporting lease. Vulnerable areas should be identified and a plan put in place, agreed by both parties. During late winter / early spring, when the browsing pressure is at its greatest, shooting pressures should be hard on the agreed sites to reduce deer activity and numbers on those areas. Active culling from all of the forest areas with limited sporting. The sporting income should be used to offset the costs of the culling / crop protection, but the priority must be a proper balance between sport and tree protection. I haven't touched on the venison situation in great depth. We do have our own venison business here, which has saved the day for us because the general trade is a disaster. I heard today from one of the game dealers that he said 2 or 3 years ago, strip line coming in from New Zealand was around about £23-24 a kilo, but he can buy New Zealand strip line today at £10 a kilo. So I don't think we'll be seeing improved prices for carcasses. But I'm happy to sort of talk more about that if needed. But I think that's, Raymond, that's me pretty well done, and thank you.
Winston, thank you very much for that. That was
We appear to have lost you, Raymond. Can you hear me? So could I invite Jamie and Tom to join Winston and turn your cameras on, and we can take some questions.
Okay, I'm here.
So when that was a quite fascinating talk you've just given, I'm going to start with a question that's not one of the ones which was posed earlier, but one that Ben Clinch has just asked in the chat. Best practice in the UK is shooting stationary deer in extensive woodland areas in most of Europe. Roe and red deer are collaboratively moved and shot on the move to achieve an effective cull. Is our own woodland management in this country hamstrung by current best practice? Should we be looking at infrastructure and planning to facilitate that? What are your views on that win?
Well, I've been fortunate enough to sort of partake in some of the European activities in my sort of misspent youth, and their forests are quite often much more accessible and slightly different structured. It would be very difficult, I think, on Cowell to create what I'm trying to find a word that isn't deer drives, but I mean, I sort of do understand what happens on the continent, and well, I mean, if the situation was in the right, you know, if we had the right access, the right type of forest, I'm sure it would work here as well. But it wouldn't. I don't think it would work very well where we are, to be perfectly honest.
Yes, I mean most of the those in the audience who participated in organised deer shoots on the continent will probably have done it in those glorious hardwoods. Exist over there much more predominantly, certainly, than your part of the country. But to do that, Tom, Tom and Jamie, would there be much legislative change required to enable that to happen?
I think there would be, and Jamie will be able to go into a bit more detail on that. But I think there would also be some welfare concerns as well raised as an issue with shooting at moving deer. I know that down in England there are areas where they have what they call movement days as opposed to driven days, where they try to move deer generally around from woodland block to woodland block. But as Winston suggests, that wouldn't work on Cowell. I don't think the deer are likely to stay stuck in the woodland, and also, you know, moving deer in the scale of woodland that you've got on somewhere like Cowell would be very, very difficult. I suspect there'd also be some sort of problem with the legislation on chasing animals with hounds, which is tied up with the hunting debate. So there would be obviously problems with that as well.
Could I just come back in just very quickly? We back in the EFG days, we invited the Devon and Somerset staghounds to come to Cowell, and it was spectacularly unsuccessful. We surrounded the forest with rifles and then unleashed the hounds in, and the hounds went round and round in these very large areas of Sitka spruce, and the deer were just not prepared to come out. And I mean, the impression was that there were very few deer in these forests, but we now know there were many more than we believed, because they just went round in circles in the thickets.
Jamie, any comment from you on that subject?
I mean, Tom covered it in terms of the legislative barriers, in terms of hunting with dogs acts. I suppose it is an interesting one. I'd probably go back to the kind of cultural differences between how deer management, deer stalking is done in the UK versus the continent. And, you know, it would require significant change in everybody's attitude, I suppose, to how we do it, notwithstanding the legislation. I'm not saying rightly or wrongly. It's just whether we're too far down a road to make that change across an entire sector to do things differently, or whether now's the time to look at, you know, alternatives. As you know, I think there's another question back from Ben. You know, woods are being restructured, as Winston said. It's clearly not going to work in some parts of the country, but it may well could be an effective tool elsewhere. But I still sense there would be that kind of more general cultural blockage, perhaps, to it. But who knows?
Yeah, I guess you're right there.
My apologies for my IT failing on me. I knew it was too good to be true to get through a meeting like this without something going badly wrong with it. We have a question from Simon Hart. Winston in particular, if not reintroducing wolves, what are your thoughts on lynx? Where a lot of the work done on lynx seems to suggest, at least, that they might have a very significant effect on controlling roe deer numbers, if not red.
Yes, I think they would. I think that from what little I know about lynx, they definitely would. I'm quite sure have an impact on the roe deer numbers. For us here in Cow, I keep referring to Cow, but because that's really all I know about the sort of deer world in Scotland. But our problem is with the red deer and not the roe. But there will be areas, and I suppose places like Kielder and I don't know, in the borders where the roe deer are probably the biggest problem. I don't know. And there is some proposal for that, the reintroduction of lynx, I believe, is there not?
Yeah. Jamie and Tom, what are your views on lynx reintroduction?
Well, as a stalker, I'm probably less concerned about it, again, because it's red deer that I'm largely dealing with within some of the forestry blocks that I've put in. Native woodland, that is. It might be beneficial to reduce the deer numbers, roe deer numbers, which seem to be able to get in and out of deer fencing at will. But certainly wouldn't want my lynx on the hill for attacking my sheep. But I think there are other side effects as well. I believe that 5% of a lynx's diet is made up of foxes, so there'd be other knock-on effects to having a lynx there that we haven't really considered. But I think it's roe deer that it would be most beneficial if they were introduced, but I think there would be a big lobby against it.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add, I know we could probably spend the rest of the afternoon on the pros and cons of reintroducing large predators to deal with the perceived deer problem. As I understand it, that trial area in Kielder is still alive and sort of going through a churn of consultations and views on it. As Tom alluded to, they're kind of pretty polarized views, as we all well know, and depending which sector you sit in to it. Fundamentally, Scotland is heavily managed now, as we know, and do we have these big wilderness areas left, really, where wolves, lynx, bears, whatever we're talking about, could be at home and living alongside agriculture, forestry, sporting deer interests, hydro, rewilding, wind farms, I mean, you name it. So that's always the example I give. It's certainly from a deer, what I deal with day in, day out is a landscape where deer are a pinball being bounced around multiple property ownerships, doing lots of different things for a variety of reasons. And in some places they're welcome, and in some places they're not, and in some places somewhere in between. So it is an interesting one. And I, personally, if there's opportunities to find some as a bit of a trial, yes, I mean, I think we need to be open to change, but as we well know, the kind of politics of it and the vocal views on either side of the camp do present some significant challenges to that.
Mm-hmm. Winston's view was, I think I'm right in saying, was that in order to establish broadleaves and tender conifers within large areas of forests which are being restructured, that the use of fences would continue. What's the views from Nature Scot and from ADMG on that? And could I also just ask a supplementary, given that roe deer, the biology of roe deer is very, very different to that of red deer, do we see that collaborative working on trying to control roe deer numbers within largely forested areas is something that would actually work?
Okay, I could start on the fencing one. I mean, yeah, the experiences of Winston and Cowell and counterparts at Forestry Land Scotland, you know, it's a really interesting example of where deer fencing continues to be essential in some areas in order to grow trees. And as we well know, there are polarized views on the pros and cons of fences and the impact from a landscape scale, but a recognition that, it continues to be a valued tool in certain areas. So I don't think we will get to a point where, you know, foresters can do what they need to do in the absence of fencing, but clearly it's very geographical and species dependent. And it will also depend in terms of the stock and resource on the ground and a whole range of other factors, as all of you know much better than I. It was obviously captured within the deer working group recommendations. I think I can't remember which specific one, but there is one around deer fencing in there, so it will continue to be on the radar. So I see where we go. Tom, I don't know if you want to
could I come back in there,
Yep.
Raymond, please?
Yes.
I'd just like to say that, you know, deer fencing without being policed and maintained can equally well be a disaster. And I've seen examples of that, particularly in our terrain where you've got deep burns, landslips, etc., steep ground. And it's, in our opinion, the areas that are fenced are often far too large. I mean, there is one locally here that's just been planted, and there are 80 red deer inside. The deer fence is about 20 kilometres. Thankfully, it's not under our management. It's extremely steep ground, and they'll have a hell of a job getting those deer that are in there now. We're involved in another one that's just been fenced, which thankfully was on slightly smaller and on flatter ground, and the forester flagged up that whilst they were planting, they spotted some deer, and we went in, and in one day we shot 26 red deer inside, and subsequently shot another 4, which is a total of 30 inside. Thankfully, we're not seeing any deer inside just now, but you know, as Tom pointed out, you know, deer are past masters at getting in. So I think that it's necessary for those soft conifers and hardwoods for deer fencing, but it's not something. It's not a quick fix. You don't put the deer fence up and walk away and everything's wonderful. It's got to be followed up and maintained and policed regularly.
I'd agree with that. My personal experience of establishing trees on what was open ground is that I couldn't have done it without deer fencing. It wouldn't have happened. But if the fences aren't checked regularly, then the damage of deer that are trapped within the fencing can be equally bad, if not worse, as they were, you know, otherwise. And I think that fencing should be an important tool for Scottish Government and for foresters in establishing trees, particularly those ones that are vulnerable. But you have to maintain those fences. And I agree with Winston, the larger the plantation of native woodland that I've planted using fencing, the more difficult it is to manage the deer within that, and you can really struggle to find deer. I mean, it's a bit easier now with the use of thermal imaging and that sort of thing, but you can spend days looking for deer in plantations within fencing. On roe deer and collaboration, Jamie will probably have more experience of this than I have, because I've largely dealt with red deer. But I suppose in terms of collaboration for roe deer, if there's damage being done to forestry and a group of forest managers deem it necessary to get together to collaborate to deal with the roe deer, then it's a benefit. There's no doubt about that. I managed ground where there weren't any roe deer. Winston will know this, or very few roe deer in the 90s. And it's not uncommon to see 16, 20, 30 in a day here if you're out looking for roe deer now, because of the trees that we've planted. And those roe deer have come in from outside. They haven't just appeared. They've travelled in from elsewhere. So roe deer do move around as well, and they do move into areas. And I know from my own experience that if you've got a small plantation of trees, a roebuck will get in there pretty quickly, even if it's not surrounded by other forestry.
Yeah, and just to add to that, my experiences of, I suppose, the deer management groups that are more roe deer centric. So thinking about SDMO deer group, for example, Borders deer group, Sika deer are obviously a factor in that, and as has been alluded to already this afternoon, the kind of species, the nature of the different species, the territorial behavior versus herding species of deer does require different models of collaboration. But just because one's territorial and non-herding doesn't mean there isn't value in collaborating. And some of those groups, continue, whilst they all have the same objectives, large scale commercial forestry over, fairly large upland sites, predominantly, where the primary species might be roe, there is still value in them talking to each other, sharing information, sharing data, looking at trends. As Tom said, spring dispersals of deer, bucks being territorial, chasing younger animals out, they do move around still, and one property's activity will impact on a neighbour's, and looking at fecundity rates, carcass weights. There's lots of things I think to be learnt, regardless of the deer species, but clearly in terms of linking it back to those collaborative models and the burning need to collaborate, and the why, is a deer group just a talking shop, or is it actually much more than that people can get value from, learn from practitioners? People like Winston, we've got a huge amount of experience in certain, from different parts of the country, and then sharing that. And as forest managers, I suppose it gives you the opportunity to understand, making that link between the person behind the trigger to those managing the forest and the responsibilities you have in terms of to your ultimately owners of those forests. And I think Winston made a good point, making sure the two parties are talking to each other and understanding the subtleties of different species, different landscapes, fencing, no fencing, etc. That kind of dialogue is essential if deer management is going to be effective in that landscape.
Thanks very much for that. We have reached the end of our allotted time. There are a few other questions that have come in. If everybody's happy, and if we could continue maybe for another 5 minutes or so, that'd be fine.
Yeah.
There have been a number of questions that have come in, and we've dealt with some, so there's no need to actually go into them in any detail. But there's been a couple that have come in that are saying things like, we've got government targets for woodland expansion. Should we not be developing targets for balanced wildlife populations? And other people have been asking, if the estimated number of red deer in the country is 350,000, what actually do people consider to be an acceptable number? Not sure whether that's actually answerable, or do people agree with the ADMG view that it's not so much gross numbers that count as what the impact on habitats is?
Could I start there, Raymond? Can I?
Yeah.
There was a research done in Cowell many years ago by Dr. Phil Ratcliffe. I don't know whether you ever met him or not, but that was funded by the Red Deer Commission, Institute of Terrestrial Ecology, and the Forestry Commission. And he's not a forester and he's not a stalker, so he's a scientist, and he did some extremely good work on the red deer in Cowell. And according to him, and we have to, I think, believe him, that you need deer densities somewhere between 2 and 5 per 100 hectares to achieve success with planted hardwoods and soft conifers, particularly planted hardwoods, with no fencing. And I would suggest that we don't actually, the problem is we don't know what our deer densities are, but I think our deer densities in Cowell will be pushing on 20 per 100 hectares. And how we get them from 20 to 5 that's the challenge. And I think it's not necessarily deer numbers. Obviously, deer numbers are related to density, but I think it's density that is the key factor. But they are extreme. It will be incredibly difficult to achieve those low densities.
Tom, anything to add?
I mean, it's the perennial question, and you sort of summed it up. I mean, I think it is important to look at damage and try and limit the damage that's being done. I mean, in the open range, we're, as deer management groups, all undertaking habitat impact assessments now to try and learn from the grazing that is happening to the heather, and to try and limit damage where it's taking place. In the forest, it's so much more difficult. We don't have helicopters to count deer. We don't have even the drones that Jamie's looking into at the moment with Nature Scott. You know, they may not be able to monitor deer numbers. It's very difficult. The Deer Working Group report suggested that on the open hill there should be a density of no more than 10 deer per square kilometre, and the SNH report prior to that suggested that on the open range there was a density of 9.3 deer per square kilometre. So we're potentially, on average across Scotland, we're potentially below that level already. Now there are hotspots, obviously, as well. But there is a potential, as Winston suggests, that densities in conifer woodlands could be much, much higher than that. And how you control that and how you deal with that is a real challenge. There's no doubt about that. I mean, when it comes to deer figures and deer counting, Jamie will be more knowledgeable than I will. And he's spent a lot of time counting deer as well over the years.
Yeah, I mean, just to add a little bit to that, as Tom said, it's the age-old debate, you know, impacts versus numbers. The working group, we're heavily focused on that. We will continue to see this 1 million deer figure quoted both in these reports and publicly in the press, I no doubt, in the coming days. You know, target densities on the open range are different to what they will be in woodland, as has been said. You know, no doubt that deer densities in some of these woodland areas will be significantly higher. So there's an expectation, you know, from SG now that 10 is the upper limit. That will have, you know, potentially significant repercussions for some areas of the open range. But equally, if we look at applying that in how that relates to woodland areas, and I go back to the point I made earlier that I think as forest managers, you are responsible for deer in the woods. And so that interplay between movements of deer from open range into woodland and dealing with what you've got, given it's often an unknown, is challenging, you know, for ourselves in terms of our role to, you know, enforce that, regulate that. I guess that's all going to be to thrash out in the coming weeks, months, years around how that will work in practice. And I think that's potentially where those challenges lie. But we recognise that, you know, absolute numbers, you know, what is the magic number? Nobody knows that. I think we have to be realistic and look at it at that more local scale, local impacts, local population information, local culling levels to kind of inform local decision making and make sure that's adaptive. That's got to be the key. You know, and then, you know, as Winston says, you've got parts of the country like Cal where, you know, it's very much compounding some of those challenges. We've got the perfect storm of issues there, which makes it all the much harder than other parts of Scotland. I think that debate will rumble on for some time. It has done for a long time, and it will continue to. And from ourselves' point of view, you know, ironically, within the working group report, we're under pressure to reduce spend and effort, not just for ourselves, but across all sectors in terms of reducing costs, but still expected to know how many deer there are and monitor that. So how we will do that across the landscape will continue to be a challenge for us, and we'll have to work all that out in terms of prioritizing resources, etc. But as I kind of alluded to, some of that new technology coming forward, I think, is showing good promise. No, it's not going to be able to tell you how many deer there are in 40-year-old blanket Sitka blocks, but I think it will have potentially some significant usage, you know, younger stage forestry or mixed broadleaves, etc. So I think it's quite an exciting arena, and we'll see how that, again, it's not going to be a silver bullet, but it will help feed into that more general process of understanding what deer populations are doing and trends, but then importantly link that with impacts on the ground and allow people to make those local decisions, which is, you know, generally what's happening now anyway.
I like the reference to silver bullets, particularly in relation to lead-free ammunition there, Jamie. That's very good.
It might be a bit more expensive.
We bet. Final question. There's a couple of them that are pretty closely related here, I think, from Cameron Maxwell and Ian Robinson. Cameron says that is the Scottish Government response to the Deer Working Group report not a clear indication that there has to be a step change in deer management to protect the public benefit interest? And Ian makes the point that in continental Europe, many forests are regenerated by natural regeneration. And how do they keep deer numbers down to very low levels? So I guess the question here is, if we're looking at step changes in management and trying to get numbers down to very low levels, how practically do we go about achieving that?
I would start, arguably, I think that particularly for the open range upland DMGs, we know there's been a significant step change over the last 2 years. They have, you know, come a long way, not without its challenges, and I'm not saying the model is perfect, but I think the recognition of that progress needs to be made. Clearly, government is expecting more of everyone across all sectors now, and as Tom alluded to, the focus is just not, whilst it's been historically on upland red deer and that against that traditional sporting background, it's swung backwards and forwards to more lowland type settings, to different species of deer to agricultural. You know, it's firmly now, I think, at the door of foresters as well. So I think collectively, yeah, we continue to need to change how things are done and explore the different models, learn lessons, even from the last 12 months about what's working, what's not. But it's certainly an interesting time for everyone involved. But, you know, I guess it's all to play for, from whichever camp you're in.
I think just in response to Cameron and to Ian, the point 97 of the Deer Working Group report was Scottish Government should develop proposals for a planned cull approval system. Now that's been approved and will be going ahead by the look of things, subject to consultation. It says that the Scottish Government agrees that there may be benefits to introducing a cull approval system. So there could be quite a lot of legislation going forward that affects, you know, the approval of culls in areas. So we may be put under considerable pressure going forward. And on Ian's question about continental Europe, well, I wish we had the environment that they have on continental Europe, you know, here, because we've got 3 meters of rain here a year, and we've got knee-high grass or heather, and that's quite difficult for the trees to compete with. Years ago in the 90s, and again, Winston will remember this, we tried to undertake a massive natural regeneration process across a large part of our hill, and it involved culling hundreds of deer, and it was very unpopular at the time with some of our neighbours. And we got deer down to somewhere in the region, I've got the figures, of 4 deer per square kilometre, and we had no natural regeneration whatsoever. None. Because in the snow, the trees would be taken out by the deer. Now there were no sheep on that ground then. And I think the trees found it very difficult to compete, and there wasn't the parent trees there. There wasn't a good enough seed source, and I think that was the biggest problem. In lots of these areas of bare hill, the seed source is not present for natural regeneration.
Yeah, I remember it well, Tom. It was a strange scheme to work with natural regeneration when there was no seed source to naturally regenerate from. And it also kind of relates as well to the point you made right at the beginning about the ground preparation guidelines changing. I think at that time, doing any sort of mechanical ground preparation to get rid of what was a very thick grass sward and actually create a seed bed suitable for regenerating trees was frowned upon, and I'm afraid it was probably doomed to disaster.
Yeah.
I think we have gone well over our time now. One final point made by Ben Clinch: should all foresters carry either a 3006 or a 308? which I think, you know, there is probably some real relevance in that. If we are going to be reducing deer numbers, we do need to have people out there actually doing it, and getting the physical resource of rifles on the ground to control deer numbers in forestry situations has never been a particularly straightforward or easy thing to achieve. Could I just please thank on all our behalf our 3 speakers this evening. Thanks very much, Jamie, Tom, and Winston. Thanks again to Scottish Forestry and the Industry Leadership Group for sponsoring this meeting. Jamie Farquhar for all his time in organising it, and most of all to everyone for taking the time to attend. I hope you found it as interesting and useful as I did, and I hope to see everyone again at the next meeting, to be arranged sometime in the autumn, hopefully without IT problems, and hopefully face to face. So thank you very much, and a good evening to you all.
Thank you. Thank you, Raymond.
Thanks, Raymond.